Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this next chapter Q&A session. We're streaming to you from the lands of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present and to First Nations communities of all lands that this broadcast is reaching. My name's Veronica Sullivan and I'm the Head of Programming here at the Wheeler Centre.
And I'm Sophie Black, I'm the Head of Special Projects. Now, before we kick off, the most important thing to remember in all of this is the closing date for applications. You have just under a month. The applications for the next chapter for 2021 close on Friday, the 23rd of July at 5 p.m. sharp. So everybody write that down. Now, Veronica and I are here for the next hour, and we really encourage you to submit any questions you might have about the next chapter scheme. And we encourage you to do that through the YouTube chat box. So if you are watching this on the Wheeler Centre website, just click on the title of the video and that will take you through to the YouTube page where you can see the chat box there. Before you do write a question, have a little scroll through the frequently asked questions link on the Wheeler Centre website as well, because that's pretty comprehensive and you might find some answers there. And you'll find that at thenextchapter.wheelercentre.com/FAQs. So just to recap on what exactly the next chapter scheme involves, each year we pick 10 outstanding writers and we give them $15,000 each to develop their work. We then match them with mentors and they work closely with those mentors over the year to bring their writing to life. And the Wheeler Centre also connects them with peers, publishers and readers. So it's a pretty special scheme that's dedicated to giving writers the time and the space to bring their writing to life.
And we've been really lucky to have incredible writers putting their hands up to mentor recipients in years past and also to judge the scheme. And this year is no exception. We have 4 amazing judges whose work spans a range of genres, styles, as does their interests and the work that they're hoping to read and assess. And this year our judges are Claire G. Coleman, Arnold Zabel, Fiona Wright and Janine Lane. So it's really an incredible lineup of people who will be reading and thinking about, discussing and assessing every application very carefully and with great consideration and care.
Now, we'll just recap on the 4 key requirements that you need to consider when you're applying for the next chapter before we're going to get on to any of our questions. First of all, you need to tell us what you seek to get out of this scheme in 300 words or less. And in those 300 words, you need to explain how you will personally benefit from this opportunity. Have a think about any ways that you may have specifically encountered ways in which the publishing industry might have been inaccessible to you. Have a think about that. That can mean many different things. And if somebody is nominating you, which is also an option, they will write this section. Now, the second thing is you need a 1-page letter of support from someone who can vouch for your capacity to deliver the work and vouch for your level of commitment and level of motivation. Now, this can be absolutely anybody who has witnessed your dedication and witnessed you work. So it could be someone in a writers group that you might be a member of. It could be a really close friend. It could be a relative. This is a space for them to really write about what they've observed and how much they think you will be dedicated to and be motivated to complete the scheme.
The next requirement of the application is to provide a brief summary of your writing sample. That's a maximum of 200 words. And you can use this for anything that you think is really important that you want the judges to keep in mind when they're reading the work. So it can be about what inspired you to write it, the context of the sample and where it sits in relation to the full-length manuscript that you're hoping to write. Anything else that you think would be useful for people to have in mind when they're going in to jumping in and diving in and reading the writing. And then that leads, of course, to the final and very important requirement for the application, which is the writing sample. It's for fiction or non-fiction prose. It's about 10,000 words. There's a 10% leeway either side. For poetry, it's 10 to 15 completed pages, and we hope that poets would come into the scheme with a view to producing a full-length book of poetry, so over 50 pages. And for graphic novel applicants, it's 15 to 30 pages of a work in progress. For hybrid works, and we do find that people have all different kinds of styles, and experimental writing forms are really welcomed and encouraged in the next chapter. So often we get questions about, well, my work straddles different genres, or it doesn't necessarily neatly fit into poetry or prose, or it's partly illustrated but it also has prose elements. Anything like that where it's specific and you just want to make sure that you're hitting the right length, we encourage you to get in touch with us and just have a chat about it, and we'll kind of nut that out together in a way that makes sense. So that's the 4 key bits of info that we need from you in your application. Please do send through any questions in the YouTube chat, but we did have a few submitted prior to the event, and so we're going to kick off by answering a few of those. So first up, Shyamala asks, I only have my husband or my sister who can vouch that I can deliver the work. I'm connected to writing groups, but they haven't really seen my work and they're not really in a position to vouch for me. I'm not sure if this will be accepted. So this touches on what Sophie was talking about previously with the letter of support. The first thing that I would say in relation to this is that it will be accepted. Anything will be accepted. You need to provide a letter of support, but really anybody can write it. And we've had successful applicants in the past whose letters of support have come from their partner, their mother, as So said. And it doesn't need to be like a university lecturer or an editor or someone in the industry. That can be great, as long as they actually know that you're dedicated. So Shyamala, it's really up to you. You could ask your husband or your sister to do the vouching. You could ask your writers group. But if you're saying that your husband or your sister are the people who are most able to vouch for your capacity to deliver the work, and that you're not sure that the writing group are in that position, I would say go with the former. Go with the people who know you best. Go with the people who have seen how much care and dedication you put into your writing. And again, don't feel like it has to be a certain threshold of industry experience or, proof of X number of publications, because it's not about that at all. It's about your commitment, and that if you come into this scheme, which is a developmental scheme, that you will spend the 12 months that you're in the next chapter absolutely making the most of every moment. And the people who know you best are often the people who are best placed to speak to that.
I think I remember we have had at least one letter from somebody's mum, and it was a beautiful letter, and that they were successful, that applicant was successful. So yeah, it's all about getting somebody who can speak really personally and really put you and your work in context. Yeah. So I have a question here from Sally, who's just checking some entry criteria, and she asks if she can submit the first few thousand words of an entry that she submitted in 2018 and all the rest of the work be new work. So this is a question around, if you've entered before, can you enter the same work? Now, we ask that you don't submit exactly the same piece of work, but you can rework a sample substantially, but it has to be quite substantial, and this is where we get a little tricky with some maths. We ask that around 75% of the work has been substantially reworked. So, Sally, it depends what you mean by a few thousand words, and it also depends on the genre of the work that you are submitting. If you're unsure about any of this stuff, and if that is too unclear, I mean, we're obviously not going to measure, we're not going to get the calculator out here. This is an approximation, but we need to be assured that at least 3/4 of the work has been pretty much reworked. There is a field on the application form that prompts you with the question, anything else? And I would put an explanation there around what you've reworked and how much you've reworked it. And that should be sufficient. But if you're still unclear, there is always a phone number and an email that you can access on the Wheeler Centre Next Chapter website, and we can talk you through that as well.
Yes, beautifully put. Next up, we have a question from Tamara that was pre-submitted, and we have one from Kalem that's just come through live, and I think they're both quite connected to each other. So Kalem's asked, does the 10,000 words need to be from the beginning of the manuscript, or can it be from anywhere? And Tamara's question was on a similar note, but more about asking historically in the 3 years of the scheme to date, which applicants are more likely to be successful? The ones who submit the first 10,000 words, or the ones that pick and choose different parts to submit? So the answer to Kalem's question is your sample can come from anywhere in your work. It definitely doesn't need to be the first 10,000 words. It's not some competitions ask for like the first 3 chapters of a manuscript. That's not necessarily the case here because, again, this is a developmental scheme. We don't necessarily expect that you've got a polished, ready-made sample that is that exact lead-in. Historically, I would say that it's been a real mix, like it hasn't been one or the other that is strongly favoured, and ultimately it comes down to the quality of the writing, and that's what the judges are connecting with. We've got judges who are writers themselves, but who are also creative writing teachers, critics, and keen readers, and I think like they're smart enough to to kind of jump in head first. If you're not giving them that lead in, they'll figure it out. The main thing is just to make sure that your writing is at strongest. And so you might feel that your first 10,000 words of the project shows that best. You might feel that a bit of a sample of bits and pieces from throughout shows that best. There's no right or wrong. If you are picking and choosing a few different sections that are not chronological, you could include a line or two between each section that just explains, what's happened in the interim or where we're at now. But I wouldn't go too far into using the sample as a place to outline the entire plot, because if you are including any of that info, it's still included in your total word count, and you want the judges to read as much of your writing as they possibly can. And you've got that summary field in the application itself to explain the context for the work and what it's about. So as with many questions that we try and answer, often the answer is whatever suits you best is the way that you should approach it. And you certainly wouldn't be disadvantaged from choosing to submit some non-chronological or some different excerpts from throughout the work.
Yeah, I think with this sort of thing, it's a bit of a gut feeling as well. It's that favourite section of writing that you feel like it leaps off the page, and similarly you hope it leaps off the page for the judges.
Yeah, and that I think that it represents you and your work most accurately as well, because you might be like, well, my first 10,000 words is strong, but it's also doesn't give you a full sense of the breadth. Or the first 10,000 words might be this incredible example of how you can drive a plot and create a narrative and characterization really, really immediately. So those are, there are lots of really positive qualities that you can show off in different ways, and think of it as an opportunity to show different things and think about which things you want to show most, rather than, a disadvantage or a detraction from sharing your work.
All right, so let's dig out another question here. So Adrian has asked, what sort of qualities are you looking for when considering a graphic novel submission? We had our first graphic novelist in our cohort this year, don't we, Ronnie? Which is really, really exciting. So we're hoping for more. The amazing Mia Nee is incredible and has hopefully inspired more graphic novelists to apply. And look, the general answer for this is that, like all of the work, it's judged on strong storytelling and a distinctive voice. That's the thing that is going to make it stand out. In terms of artistic skill, that is obviously a factor in a way that isn't for the other genres, but it doesn't necessarily have to be incredibly polished. It's again giving the judges the flavour of what that finished product would look like. So it could be sketched or thumbnail. You might have a couple of pages that represent or show what a final product might look like, and then the rest could be sketched out. As long as there's sort of an indication of what that finished artwork would look like, that's more than enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And our next question was whether you can apply with a screenplay. Unfortunately, that's one of the few forms that is not eligible for the scheme. So it's just for prose, poetry, and graphic novels, and works that sort of move between those forms. Screenplays are not eligible at the moment. So please keep the questions coming in the YouTube chat. And while we wait for those to come through, we might just go through a few other FAQs that have come up in the past.
Sure.
So one that's come up a lot previously is, and we've touched on this already, is that people wanting to know whether they need to have a body of work, they need to have an established name as a writer, do they need to have interest from publishers or agents that they can point to? And the answer to that is absolutely not a requirement. There is no expectation that you'll have any particular accolades or publication record. Obviously, many people who are seriously dedicating them to their writing might have some of those things, depending on how long they've been working at it and how many barriers they've had in the industry, all of those kinds of considerations. So the judges really, obviously it's great to see if somebody has got a publishing history. That can often be an indication that they've been working really hard for a while. But the judges also consider that there are lots of obstacles and barriers, some of them personal, some of them structural, some of them systemic, that can make it harder for people to have a publication history or to have accessed, formal writing education or classes. So definitely no expectation or requirement of a particular level of achievement. And again, looking at the 30 writers so far who've been selected for the scheme over its first 3 years, it's a really wide range. Some people have, been fairly well known and have had various credits to their name. Some people have, had been studying PhDs of creative writing. Some people hadn't really published anything before, but the voice was strong, the story, the sample writing was really strong, and they spoke to how passionate they were about their craft and that they wanted the opportunity to develop it in their application. And really, in the application form, there are 2 fields. There's one for any previous publications that you want to tell us about, and there's one for any previous writing-related education or employment history. Those are both optional, and if you want to put things in there, if you have things to share, fantastic. If you don't, that's totally okay as well. So there's an opportunity to share, but ultimately the 4 questions that Sophie and I outlined at the start are the main things that the judges are looking at. And so that's about you as a person and as a writer, what your work is, why you want this opportunity and how you would make the most out of it, your letter of support from someone who knows you and knows your work, and then the writing sample itself. The other stuff is great, but it's not essential.
Absolutely. Another question that does come up quite a lot, comes up each year, is whether or not the work in progress that you submit needs to have an Australian theme. And I guess the short answer is no, but then the long, more philosophical answer is yes, in that every kind of theme that you might be thinking of submitting is potentially an Australian story, and that's part of what the next chapter is about, and why the next chapter was started to sort of change that notion of what makes a story Australian, and to change the nature of the bookshelf, to get new bylines on the bookshelf, to encourage risk taking, to encourage a more expansive way of thinking about what our stories are and who's telling those stories as well. So I think people sometimes get confused or are unsure if perhaps their protagonist is, I don't know, they're in another country. Maybe the story is set in another country. That doesn't matter in any way. None of those sorts of things preclude your work sample from being eligible.
Yeah, and it could be a fantasy work that's not even set on Earth.
It could be on another planet.
Totally.
Totally. A fictional planet.
If you're, you're an Australian citizen or resident and you're applying for the scheme, then we consider that the stories that you're telling are Australian by virtue of you being an Australian person. They don't need to actually overtly have that in there.
Absolutely. I think maybe one thing to point out is that ideally, if you were successful, we do sometimes get questions from people about whether or not they could complete the mentorship remotely, as in overseas. And the answer to that is no, even though we're all very, very good at living and working remotely, given the current circumstances and the current times that we live in. Ideally, you are in the country for the most of the scheme, which runs roughly for a year. And that's for a variety of reasons. And maybe we'll take this opportunity while you're all hurriedly typing out your questions in the YouTube chat box to just go through what the year looks like, because it is quite incredible. It's an incredible opportunity. And part of today's chat is to really inspire you to just get that entry in because it's really quite a unique scheme. It kicks off in January of next year. And the way that we kick off the relationship for the 10 successful participants is to start a bit of a conversation about what they would look for in a mentor. And this is a series of conversations that we have with you about who you would most love to work with, who inspires you, what you want to work on across the course of the year, what you think your work needs, where your weaknesses are or your strengths, what you really need to focus on. This can be a variety of different things. For some people, they come armed with a manuscript of 100,000 words that they've been working on for years and years and years. And they might be looking for a mentor who might be more of a traditional editor and really get stuck into the work and go back and forth with markups. Other people might only have that 10,000 words that they finished the night before, and it's happened, and it's worked for some people. And for them, they need to really talk about the basic building blocks of motivation, of establishing a regular writing practice and what that looks like, of how to carve time out to do that sort of thing. So there are very different needs across those 10 participants, and we're very mindful of that, and the scheme is tailored accordingly. So it's personalised to each person, to each participant. It's very bespoke, to use a fancy word. And so that first conversation is all about who your dream person might be to be your mentor. And together we nut out a list of people. And the nature of this scheme is that it's very ambitious, it's very uncompromising. So if you have a look on the website at our lists of past mentors, they're quite extraordinary. So we pitch pretty high for this sort of thing. So that means you might not always get your first pick, or maybe we might have some different ideas around what we think would be best for you and what you would really benefit from. And we have that conversation, and then from that, we start approaching people, and then that takes a little while, and then officially the mentorship kicks off, and you hit the ground running. Your mentor might be in the same city as you, they may not be, they might be in another part of the country, they may even be overseas. So you might be lucky enough to have coffee, or you might be doing it remotely. And then alongside that, once that mentorship kicks off, that lasts for the year. You meet with them or talk with them at least 6 times across that year. And then across the course of the year, there's also a whole bunch of other opportunities as well. You're in conversation with people from the Wheeler Centre who are helping to support you and offer you other opportunities in addition to that mentorship. Of course, there's a $15,000 payment as well, which makes all the difference. For many people, it means chucking in a day of work so that they can dedicate it to their writing, and that's a game changer for them. And then there's opportunities like coming together at the Varuna Writers House in the Blue Mountains, where you get to hang out with the other 9 participants as well and meet them face to face, and dedicate time to your writing. Each of you is given a room a beautiful room overlooking sort of the Blue Mountains, where you get to work on your writing and come together at night and during the day to work on workshops, and to just discuss your writing and share your writing with each other. And then there are other opportunities across the year, like appearing at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and participating in the Sydney Writers' Festival, and then bookended at the end of the year, as your mentorship is starting to come to a close, there's the opportunity to take part in a 2-day publisher workshop. So this is the stage of the scheme where you're actually maybe lucky enough to start thinking about putting your work into the world. Maybe your manuscript is almost there. And these workshops are an opportunity to not only hear from publishers, but meet with them and talk to them specifically about you and your work. And also, again, hang out with your fellow participants, who are like another support structure across the year. We set you up in a Slack channel so that you can be talking to each other, you can be sharing stories, you can be getting advice off each other. So there's all these different tiers of support and other opportunities across the year that I won't go into now, but that gives you an idea of the shape of the year. Have I forgotten anything there, Ronnie?
I think that's a spot on summary. There's lots of little bits and pieces as well, but certainly the mentorship, the relationship with your fellow recipients, the opportunity to go to Varuna and to Sydney Writers Festival, and then the publisher workshops at the end. That's sort of loosely the touchstones throughout the year. We've actually got a few more questions that have come through.
Fantastic.
And one of them touches on the mentor-mentee working relationship, so it's probably a great one to go to, and we've just sort of been speaking about that. Comes from Alana. And they've asked, does the mentor read some of the writer's work before each meeting? So I guess this touches on the different ways that you can approach it. Maybe tell us a little bit about that, Sophie, and also about how the mentor is approached to be the mentor.
So initially we approach the mentor, and bear in mind that these people are very, very accomplished, very busy writers in their own right, who are often working on their own work or they're launching a new book. So we are very, very lucky that the people of the calibre of the people that we've asked have actually taken time out of their diary to really consider it, and in many, many cases have said yes, which is quite a testament to the reputation of the scheme and the ongoing support of the scheme. And just a side note, some of those mentors have gone on to be judges. Some of the judges have gone on to be mentors. There's a really lovely longevity to the relationship and the support that this scheme has enjoyed, and we're now going into its 4th year. So we approach a mentor and we give them a little bit of a snapshot of the person that we're approaching them with, or on their behalf, and we give them a little bit of an outline of who they are, and we offer the opportunity for them to read their work too. So, I mean, the first thing we need to get around is whether they have time in their diary, and then if they're interested, we usually share their work with the permission of the person, of course, and then if the mentor feels like the work resonates, which is that's really quite important, isn't it, Ronnie? They have to make sure that the work inspires and resonates with them, otherwise there's not enough to go on there. They need something to be able to hook into and to think, yep, okay, I really want to hang out. I want to support this person across at least a year. And if that work does resonate, then we get a yes, and we put the two of them in touch. We set them up with a bit of a memorandum of understanding, which is a fancy word for a bit of a questionnaire, to sort of share with each other, hopefully over a casual coffee at best, to give them some sort of parameters around how they establish the relationship, what are the expectations on both sides, given everyone's busy in different ways, and what are they hoping to get out of the year. And so that's the very start of that relationship. And as I mentioned before, it can roll out in very, very different ways depending on the writer and depending on the mentor's style as well. Some mentors, Maria Tamarkin comes to mind. She is more of she's everything, but she's also a life coach, and is incredibly dedicated and has kept in touch with mentees beyond the year. And some mentors are very, very hands-on as well. They just really get stuck into the work. So there might be a scenario where they're emailing back different drafts across the year. But again, it's all about the expectations and setting those expectations at the start. That's not necessarily what some other mentors offer.
Great. We've got a few more questions, so I'm going to sort of rattle through them. Eleanor has asked if there's any flexibility with the age range criteria in terms of the intended audience of the work. They're working on a manuscript for younger readers, around 13 years old, but it might end up working better for a younger group. So can they still apply?
That sounds like a little bit of a grey area. I mean, we do ask that because young adult fiction is absolutely eligible, but we ask that it sort of tracks to 13 plus, don't we, in our fine print. So given that that's that sounds like something that we wouldn't want you to second guess the marketing of the work, basically. I mean, part of the ambition for the next chapter and the scope of the next chapter is such that we want to untie writers from thinking about the commercial viability of the work, thinking about how it's going to be marketed, thinking about how it's going to be packaged up. One of our observations through working with writers for over a decade at the Wheeler Centre is that very often, especially first-time writers, can get snapped up and they sign a deal before the ink on the draft is even dry, and they don't have enough time to really sink into the work before they're thinking about all of those marketing considerations. So I would say don't talk yourself out of applying if you think maybe this is more suited to 8 and 9-year-olds. I think there's enough grey area there for us to consider the sample of the work, and that consideration would then come down the track. Would you agree with that, Ronnie?
Totally agree. And I think the judges, if the judges are having a conversation about that work, they might feel differently than you feel. And so, let them kind of have that opportunity to read the work. And if they connect with it and they think it's incredible, if they think it has crossover appeal, if there are books that are for younger readers, for teens, or even for kind of middle grade, but that actually could appeal to older teens as well, then that would still be eligible. So I think, not talking yourself out of it is a really great way to put it. Alex has asked approximately how many people apply for the next chapter each year.
Roughly, if we average it out, we get around 650.
I think it's higher than that.
It's higher.
Yeah.
Higher.
I'd say I'm very bad at maths. I think the average is like around 1,000.
It's around 1,000.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really, I undersold it there. But look, don't let those numbers put you off as well, because you never know what the judges are looking for, and
every entry gets read and considered.
Absolutely.
So it's not like they go, there's too many, we're only going to look at half of them, or we're only going to look at the first sentence because they've got too much work. It's a very thorough, rigorous judging process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kalem again has asked, is genre fiction accepted, such as horror or fantasy?
Yes.
Excellent.
That's a very simple answer. We get a lot of fantasy, in fact. Not a lot of horror. Horror would be great. Bring on the horror.
Yeah, I feel like those are, genre fiction often, it's a lot of developmental programs or like mentorship programs or manuscript programs tend to skew towards literary.
Yes.
And so in some ways, writing genre fiction in Australia, in a small market that doesn't have a lot of publishing opportunities for genre, in some ways, if your work is writing into those genres, then that in itself can present a barrier to access. So I think that can actually be part of the case that you could make as well, potentially.
Absolutely.
Bo has asked, if I have a manuscript sent out for consideration with literary agents, am I allowed to apply for the next chapter with a different manuscript?
You can apply with a different manuscript. You can also apply with the same manuscript if you haven't actually been picked up by an agent. So in the event that you were successful with the manuscript that you'd sent out, we would ask you to pull that manuscript for the duration of the year, so for the duration of your involvement with the scheme. And the logic and the theory around that is that again, it's about giving you the time and the space to really polish that work, to feel like you've really given it your all before anyone sets eyes on it. That's not to say you won't come back to those same agents or publishers. It's just that we really want you to dedicate that year to the work before you start thinking about that. And so in that way, we also act a little bit as human shields just for the year, where we absolutely encourage hearing from agents and publishers. That's a big part of this, but there's an understanding there that you are left alone, so to speak, for the year to continue writing away. and working away, and then we will circle back to those same people. We won't let them go anywhere, but we will circle back to them at the end of that year when you're ready.
Yeah, and those publishing workshops that Sophie mentioned that come at the end of the year are also designed to equip recipients with a really thorough knowledge and understanding of what the publishing landscape looks like, what the different considerations are for debut writers, who some of the options are, like what, the major publishers, the independents. So the hope is that at that point, you're equipped with the information to be able to know a little better how to navigate it. And also we're there to help support with that navigation process as well. From Paul asks, I haven't seen many successful applicants over 70 years old in this scheme. Do you have any advice for older applicants?
Advice for older applicants? I'm not sure that I would base specific advice. We've had a few. We have had a few. We've had... I don't want to say they're over 70, but we've had
some older recipients.
Had some older recipients, absolutely. So I guess the thing to stress here is that this is about encouraging emerging writers. So it is not based on age. It's not specifically set aside for young writers. This is about emerging writers. So this is in recognition of the fact that some writers have been working away on this for decades with not much success. Some people have initial early success and then really struggle to break through. I was speaking to an older writer just the other day about this very thing, and they were really, really wrestling with that and really frustrated by that. And based on their circumstances and what they were telling me, they would actually be eligible for this scheme, even though they've been published before. So it's about encouraging emerging writers, and it's about encouraging writers who have encountered barriers before. And sometimes that can be based on age. I think there is amongst the industry, it makes it a little harder when they're considering factors like marketability, and those sorts of things could be considered a barrier. But for us, absolutely, age is no barrier. You have to be over 18, but you could be 97 years old and successfully apply for this scheme. And we encourage you to do so.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that often the things that people ask about that they don't see a lot of representation of are the very things that can be part of your case for why you would benefit from the scheme. And equally, if you've been published before, that doesn't preclude you. We were talking about you don't need to have a particular amount of achievement or recognition, but also if you have had a certain amount and maybe you feel like you got these shots and it didn't quite work out for whatever reason and it's really hard to get your next foot in the door, that's also a really, really important narrative and an important perspective that you can share that speaks to... We know it's a really, really tricky industry to navigate, and there's lots of just hard things to figure out on your own. And if you could benefit from having some help with that, having the opportunity to have your work put before a few people, then that's exactly what Next Chapter is designed for. Our next question is, if you're entering with a memoir project where your name is mentioned, should you use a pseudonym in the submitted writing sample?
Look, it's not... I would say that... Look, I'd say it's a good idea only because the judging process is by no means a blind judging process. But in some cases, the judges might like the option of reading the work first before they review all the additional material. The material that they weigh up is weighted equally, so some judges have a different kind of process where they prefer to just read the work first, and if you suspect that your name might mean something to somebody, then...
And you don't want it to be
and you don't want it
because that could be a good thing as well, right?
But if you don't want it to be recognised, then, or you think it might somehow skew the judging process in any way, this is a bit of guesswork here. There's no harm in including a pseudonym.
And for that reason, we ask you not to put your name on the writing sample, just so that if the judges do prefer to read those blind, they have the opportunity to.
Yeah.
But they're not de-identified. They receive them in a pack with everything else.
Absolutely.
And they can easily look and see who's written that. But as Soph said, some judges just like to have that option of going into the work and letting it really punch them in the face in a good way before they then read the associated materials. So Susan has asked, can you clarify the requirement that submitted works be entirely the author's original own work? I have a poetic memoir project that includes a piece about a particular artist where I quote from a text that appears in one of the artist's works. I have permission from the artist to reference in this way, but not sure if it is against the next chapter terms and conditions. So quite a specific question, but I think a good one, because these are the kinds of things where, we might say it has to be your own work, but actually a quote here or there, if it's not, forming the vast majority of the work, it can be a really important part of what you're doing. So I think that's fine, particularly if you have their permission. You could potentially enter with a quote that you don't have permission from. You could be putting a Shakespeare quote in there, although that's out of copyright. But you know what I mean. You could be entering with a more recent quote that you don't necessarily have permission for, and that's actually fine for the entry process because we're not publishing work. It's entirely private. If there's a quote woven through that's really important to your work, then that can be fabulous. But make sure that it's clearly signposted that it's a quote, and kind of think about it as a high school plagiarism is what we're trying to avoid. That's what you're talking about. Doesn't sound like that at all. So I think it's fine.
Absolutely. And if you want to make that clear, there's that summary field, the summary of the work, and that would be the space to just make that very obvious and make it clear that you've got the author's permission.
We've got another question from Kalem, which is, if I finish my manuscript before being selected, would that be okay?
If you finished your manuscript before you were selected, that would be so okay for you. That would be amazing. I guess this comes down to, again, people come to the scheme in very different stages with their work, and there have literally been people who finished it the night before and
finished the 10,000 word sample,
the 10,000 words and have 10,000 words and come to the scheme with that. And then there are people who have had a really quite polished manuscript that they come armed with. So if you manage to do that, and if this scheme inspires you to finish that work, then it's already, done, it's already been of benefit for you. Even if you didn't get in, that would be amazing. It's helped you finish that work. But if you did get in, you're at a great advantage because you have, I guess as long as you don't have really set ideas around the shape of the work. To make the most out of your mentor, you would have to be flexible enough to say, here's my finished manuscript, but really it's far from finished. If you really want to get something out of your mentor, because you don't want to be too fixed on every word or the entire layout of the manuscript. If you've got a year to work on it, and you've got an opportunity to significantly shape it or reshape it or hone it, or and that's where it comes down to you and your temperament and what you want out of your mentor and making the most of it. But absolutely, you will have a lot of meat to work with, which is a great advantage to be in at the start of the scheme.
Yeah, it's a developmental scheme. So as long as you still feel like there's developmental work to be done. And obviously if you end up signing with a publisher, then there would be an editorial process to come. So very rarely, I'm going to say never, is a finished draft finished. You could obviously keep picking at it forever, but having a first draft or even a second draft, third draft that you're still ready to keep working on and you think would benefit from that close scrutiny for another year, that's a brilliant place to be in.
Absolutely.
And as long as you're coming to it with that positive mindset. Just a couple of more questions. Lisa has asked if can part of the sample be written in a different language if it's accompanied by a translation?
Yes. I think that we have some fractions that we've divvied up somewhere in the fine print that my brain is not coming up with right now. I don't know if yours is
Please refer to the FAQs, but I think it's as long as 50% is in English, then you can have the other 50% of your sample in a different language.
Absolutely. And, that's potentially something we'd be really excited by as well.
Yeah, because certainly in Australia, there's not a lot of non-English or bilingual publications. So again, we're looking for stories, voices, writing projects that we're not seeing on the shelves of bookstores very often, but that deserve to be out there. And
we've had at least one participant who has worked in tandem with a mentor and a translator.
Yeah, which I guess speaks also to the fact that we really try and tailor it, because for that person, a mentor was amazing. They also really wanted to have a translator to help them with getting their work to that next level. So we're open to looking at split mentorships when people have sort of different needs in different areas. One more question about COVID and travel. I think maybe we touched on this, but just to be clear, COVID is obviously restricting travel, and it's a little bit unpredictable what things are going to look like internally in Australia next year, but certainly internationally. And given that we're encouraging online working relationships, will that change the requirement for the writer to be in Australia for the duration of the scheme?
We may be being hopelessly optimistic. I don't think so, though. I think this year has proven that it is still worth being here to complete this scheme, and so we are sticking to that. Certainly last year it was very difficult for our participants to take up some of the opportunities interstate, but even so they still got to go to Varuna at the start of the scheme. And certainly this year we've been able to honour all of those travel opportunities. Might have had a bit of luck on our side, but so far, fingers crossed, none of that has been disrupted, and the hope is that it only gets easier from here.
And if things come up, we'll try and find alternatives.
Yes, which we absolutely got very good at doing last year, and it's, that is one very lucky thing about being so adept at working online, and this scheme does translate very well to remote relationships and carrying things on, such as, for example, the two-day publisher workshop that we mentioned earlier. Ideally, we have that in person, and we have had before, and last year it had to roll out online. So we can adapt, but our strong preference is that people are here in the country so that they can take advantage of all of those opportunities.
Absolutely. Another question, a really good one. Out of curiosity, who does the pre-reading before the four final judges read it? For instance, would YA entries be funneled to someone with an interest in that area, or would it go to anyone?
We have 8 readers from a variety of, who are all experienced, either editors, writers, publishers, and we make sure that they come from they cut across a variety of genres and expertise. So they might not, that particular work might not specifically be funneled to a YA writer, but certainly it would cross enough sets of eyes that they're experienced in reading that genre.
Yeah, and each entry is read by multiple people as well, not just by one person. And we ask those readers which genres they're comfortable with, and some are YA experts and some are comfortable with and love YA, but you wouldn't necessarily pick it as their number one thing. But whoever's reading the YA books has indicated that they are comfortable with YA, or that they love YA and that they would love to read and assess it. Same goes for poetry. Obviously, poetry is a really distinctive one, and not everyone does feel confident reading and assessing poetry. So, we're going to make sure that if people are reading the poetry books, they know how to interpret and read and judge poetry. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions.
Sure.
So feel free to keep popping them in the chat. Someone's asked about co-authored projects, as in 2 people applying in partnership, and whether they can be submitted.
Have we ever had that before?
I don't think so, because it's a developmental scheme that is so tailored towards 10 recipients, a mentorship, because there's so many parts of the scheme are about the individual.
Yeah.
Co-authored projects, it doesn't work in that realm. There are lots of other great opportunities that do work for that, but it's not the right fit for the next chapter, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the time we match people with mentors, and it's just not going to work, unfortunately.
That might be all the questions that have come through at this point. But feel free to get in contact with us if you have more. Like, shoot us an email, give us a phone call. In fact, I can tell you the number to call, 0390947800, and someone can answer your questions. And ditto for via email, thenextchapter@wheelercentre.com. And we love talking to people. Sophie and I have both spent many, many hours talking with writers who are interested in applying for the next chapter and just getting into the nitty-gritty of people's specific circumstances, because often, it's that uncertainty about whether you're the right fit, whether your work's the right fit, and we can just give you a straight-up answer that is tailored to what you're doing and what you need.
And sometimes it's just nice to be able to pick up the phone and ask a question. So just to remind you again, the closing date is Friday, the 23rd of July at 5 p.m.
Amazing. Thank you, Soph, and thank you all so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.